I did not expect to be a reformer in psychiatry. I did not expect, in particular, to be the first physician to ever come out publicly opposed to lobotomy and psychosurgery and to take a public stand about it. I realized that psychiatry was going in a very bad direction. I went into private practice and I expected to write novels, maybe books about psychology, and to help people being a therapist. And one day I was sitting, just looking through my mail. I was just sitting there reading newspapers, and I opened up a psychiatric newspaper, and in it I found an announcement of the Second International Conference of Psychosurgeons. The first one had occurred decades earlier at the height of psychosurgery. I couldn't believe it. They were meeting in Copenhagen, and they were giving an honorary degree of some sort of honorific prize to Walter Freeman, who had lobotomized 5,000 Americans during the Great Wave in North America that really took the brains of about 50,000 people, never opposed by anybody significantly in the medical field. And it named names of people who were doing various kinds of surgery, and it looked to me like at least one of these people was operating on children. Well, I'd only been out of my residency a couple of years, and I was not known as a big critic of psychiatry. I'd written a novel that was very critical of psychiatry, but nobody read the novel. And so I sent out requests to every single conference attendee that I could find. I finally got the agenda of the conference. Then I asked them all who else did they know who was doing psychosurgery. I told them I was a young researcher at the Washington School of Psychiatry, where I have my office. And what came in freaked me out. I could not believe the stuff these people were sending to me. At this point, there was nothing obviously political. That would come in a second avalanche of grasping what was going on. At first, there was nothing going on that was political that I could see. That would come later in a kind of a second avalanche of information. What I found that most upset me was that at the University of Mississippi in Jackson, a surgeon named O.J. Andy was operating on little children as young as age 3, 4, and 5 for hyperactivity, aggressivity, difficult behavior, without even pretending to have psychiatric diagnoses or serious disorders. These were institutionalized children. O.J. Andy was inserting multiple electrodes into various portions of these children's brains. He was stimulating them, and then he was burning holes in their heads with the electrodes by heating them up. And he was then studying the children who walked around on the ward with wires dangling out of their heads. You can imagine what all this was doing to children. I contacted a lawyer in Mississippi who was working for some sort of a freedom project, and I told him about the institution that it was going on in, and I said, O.J. Andy never identifies the race of his children. That's very unusual in medical literature. I want you to go in there and find out the race of the children. He said, I don't have to go in there, sir. It's a segregated institution. And this still gives me chills. I remember waking up at night, imagining I was a little black child and smelling my brain burning. That research by O.J. Andy, more than anything, made me realize I was not going to stop. I was just not going to stop about this. I just made up my mind. I had no idea what I was getting into. But the best news, probably most encouraging news I ever got in the campaign, so I called the chairman at the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Mississippi, and he said to me, O.J. Andy? I know O.J. He's down the hall from me. His office is. I said, did you know he was putting electrodes into the brains of little children? He said, oh, God, no, I did not know that. It was the only genuine expression of horror I ever got, I believe, from anybody in establishment medicine or psychiatry. He said, I'm going to look into this. Meanwhile, I was hammering O.J. Andy and embarrassing the University of Mississippi every chance I could get, radio, TV. In those days, before the pharmaceutical companies were advertising on radio and TV, I had much more access to major media, even though I was relatively unknown. Before I was done, I'd talked about this on just about every kind of major TV show there was. Daytime TV, CBS, ABC News, and so on. They set up a committee at the University of Mississippi to require a scientific protocol for O.J. Andy, and he was the first project I stopped. He never submitted anything there. I got to debate O.J. Andy on 2 occasions, one at the National Institute of Mental Health at their giant hall. I dismembered him. It was not hard. For example, he claimed that one of the little boys who I was following through his literature and whom I discovered had a declining IQ, literally, over the years, majorly declining. And I brought it up to him in front of the audience, and his answer was, well, I've written his IQ hasn't changed because he still has the same IQ of a 3-year-old. The level of evil was very difficult for me to handle, but after this, it should have been a historical moment. The science writers of the Washington Post covered the debate by me and O.J. Andy, which was inspired by my work, and they covered it as a speech by O.J. Andy, which they much admired. It wasn't even a debate. I was somehow threatening the heart of the science writers, the science community. I had no idea that there were all these relationships going on, that what was most dear to the heart of a science writer was sucking up to the most important, innovative, so-called physicians and scientists. I might not have ever even had any kind of a movement get started, what became an international movement, because I couldn't get any science writers interested. I couldn't get anybody to cover it. Then I read one day about a congressman who had held hearings on ADHD, 1972. So I called his office, I spoke to his chief assistant, his actual major assistant, who was very interested. I said to him, I have a 100-page paper that I can't get a publisher to consider. I can't get journals to think about a piece of it. In fact, I called the Journal of Nervous and Mental Disease, asked him if I could do an article on psychosurgery, and he said, what are you talking about? Oh, he said, what are you talking about? Jose Delgado's a dear friend of mine. You'll learn more about Jose Delgado on this film, I'm sure. So I was getting nowhere, and the assistant to the congressman went to the National Library of Medicine and looked up my references to make sure I was being accurate in all my quotes, because it's 100 pages, mostly quotes. And he found that I was telling the truth, and he had the congressman publish this in the Congressional Record. So at least now it was printed. And I had a printed document that said U.S. Congress on top of it with a laudatory introduction. I thought that's the end of it. I don't know what to do now. And then somehow it occurred to me, what about the Associated Press? See, I had no experience. I didn't know anything about media or doing radio or TV in the beginning. I was actually a therapist who was writing novels and an occasional paper on things like the ethics of psychotherapy for good journals. I called the Associated Press, and here is the divine hand at work. The man who answered the phone at the AP said, "I'm sorry, sir, the science writer's on vacation." He said, "What is it you're interested in?" I said, "Well, do you get the Congressional Record?" He said, "Yes, sir, that's the clacking in the background. We get all that stuff just teletyped into us." I said, "Would you look up an article I just put in?" He did. He read it, he called me back, he said, "This is awful." The science writer, from my experience, would have actually squashed the story. He was appalled. He said, "Sir, if you will help me with the spelling and give me a little guidance, we're going to send out a 500-word press release throughout the world today." And he did. And that fortuitous, if it's fortuitous event, that the science writer was on vacation, started the anti-psychosurgery campaign. One of the things that I had not imagined early on was all of this might have political implications. It didn't dawn on me. I'm embarrassed at how naive I was about life. I had no idea the treachery of outstanding people in the field of medicine, psychiatry, neurology, neurosurgery. But I discovered a book called Violence and the Brain, and it was written by two Boston professionals. William Sweet wrote the introduction. He was arguably the most powerful physician in the country. He was the head of neurosurgery at the Mass General. Actually, getting to know these neurosurgeons taught me a new phrase. You don't have to be a neurosurgeon to be a neurosurgeon. You know, this is an expression. You don't have to be a brain surgeon to do some other activity to show you don't need high intelligence to do it. Well, the irony is you don't have to be a brain surgeon to be a neurosurgeon. All you have to do is be a butcher with a scalpel or a hot electrode or a poison you want to put in the brain. And then you put it in where you like to put it. Each surgeon likes to do it to a different part of the brain. Sort of like somebody who specializes in an uppercut, and that's what you got to look out for. Somebody else punches you in the stomach, and somebody else rabbit punches you. Each neurosurgeon has a different part of the brain they like to hit. And then they develop a theory around it. So now we're looking at violence in the brain. Vernon Mark, neurosurgeon at Boston City. Frank Irvin, psychiatrist at Harvard. William Sweet, this powerful neurosurgeon during the introduction. And I read the book. And the book is about a man at the time called Thomas R. Thomas was a brilliant engineer with patents who was terribly violent and who, after the surgery, was now completely cured without any symptoms. And the surgery consisted of putting multiple electrodes in his brain, stimulating him, even stimulating him while he walked around the ward, then burning out parts of his brain. Well, I knew this was a lie. I didn't realize how huge it was going to turn out to be. So I began to get a hold of every single thing I could find that they had written. And I was able to put together that at the point they wrote in Violence in the Brain that he'd been cured forever, he'd been just discharged from the hospital. It wasn't a follow-up at all. It was something they were saying about the time he was in the hospital. Then I found a very obscure article by these men, maybe so obscure they didn't expect anybody would find it, and it said that he'd become psychotic while they were stimulating him. And it described how he was saying, "I don't want this anymore, I don't want this anymore." And then he became peaceful and accepted the treatment after they stimulated him enough. This is key, folks. Passivity, docility, obedience is key to this entire process. And now I found myself looking at what looked like one of the worst, most egregious, involuntary, brutal experiments ever reported in the medical literature, and nobody but me that I could find anywhere seemed to be bothered by it. So I wrote this up. And then I got a phone call or a letter, don't remember now, and it said, Dr. Breggin, I don't think you know what these men have been saying. Have you seen their letter to the editor of JAMA where they talk about linking this to ghetto riots and curing ghetto rioters? And he sent it to me. Then began the avalanche. I really learned to do research, not just the research in books and articles. Before I was done, I found out that William Sweet had actually talked to the New York State Legislature trying to get funding, describing how this surgery of stimulating brains and melting holes in the heads of people might be a cure for ghetto violence, because surely the leaders of the violence were abnormal and had abnormal brains that could be fixed with psychosurgery. Then I found out that the New York Times had done a positive review of this. Then I found, of course, the JAMA article where they talked about it at length, explaining how ghetto rioters must have abnormal brains because not everybody was rioting. So clearly, the people who weren't rioting had normal brains, and the few who were leaders. We're talking now about men you could name, like Rap Brown and others, who were trying to organize the black community. We're talking about some men, I'm sure, who were very frightening, and we're talking about some other men who were outraged at the conditions of life in which the children were growing up in these ghettos and were very politically and ideologically motivated, whether you agreed with them or not. These men were, from the perspective of many in the black community, the only hope. They were heroes. And the idea that a leader must be the crazy one because you don't agree with them ideologically or because you're afraid of them doesn't make any medical sense. But boy, did it make political sense. Wow. These guys went to Congress. They got a direct science grant from Congress. Congress doesn't give grants for scientific research. They came out with $500,000. They gave it to NIMH, completely bypassed all the review processes of NIH, and said, you give it to Mark, Irvin, and Sweet for their research. And during those hearings, the head of NIMH, Bert Brown, he told them, you know, we're talking about bomb throwers. He actually used that term, I think. We're talking about bomb throwers. Then joined in the Justice Department. At the time, there was a notorious section called LEAA, the LEAA. It was doing the stuff that would see through buildings. It was doing the stuff that could knock down buildings in the inner cities. They were doing, behavioral research. They joined in the funding in a collaborative effort between the U.S. Justice Department and the National Institute of Mental Health. I mean, this was, for me, eye-popping. Now, remember, it's also a long time ago. We're much more sophisticated now, hopefully in part because of me and others like me. But this blew me away. I had so much information, I didn't know what to do with it. And I conducted a campaign aimed at these people. It turned out that there was a wonderful reporter in Boston named Gene Dietz. Gene Dietz decided to write about what I was doing in Boston. Headlines on the back pages. I once asked Gene, where did you get the ability to be skeptical about doctors like that? She said, oh, a couple of my sons are doctors. God bless Gene Dietz. Well, this is making them crazy in Boston. Meanwhile, Ted Kennedy is the head of the Health Committee in the Senate, and no one knew at the time that they had lobotomized Rosemary. I may have been one of the first people outside the tight-knit group to find out, because somebody sent me a brown envelope with pictures of Rosemary, and it had little pieces of her record indicating she'd been lobotomized. Somebody sent me a brown envelope. I've gotten a few of those that have been life-changing. This one had snippets of Rosemary's medical records showing she'd been lobotomized, pictures of her after lobotomy looking very blank, very docile, vacant, and pictures not long before the lobotomy where she was beautiful and bright and smiling. Well, I was having a lot of trouble at the time with Ted Kennedy, because Ted was, in those days I thought somebody like Ted Kennedy really wanted to support what I was doing. Turned out actually none of the main liberals supported what I was doing. My support in those days, when I really worked with Congress, came from the Black Caucus, who was distressed, to say the least, about all the implications of what I'm telling you about, from mutilating little black children in Jackson, Mississippi, to Mark Irvin's sweet selling newfangled lobotomies for black leaders. So I'm working with conservative senators very closely, and I'm actually holding press conferences with the Black Caucus and with some of its most esteemed members, Ron Dellums at the time from Berkeley, Louis Stokes from Cleveland, his brother was mayor of Cleveland at the time. And I'm now dealing with major political figures. It was so across the political arena that for a long time we had an ally whose name we didn't know in the White House, and it was Pat Buchanan. So I'm working with the far right and the far left. The far right felt that lobotomy was immoral. They felt like it was totally against family values, especially to do it to children. And I was actually able to sit with my own senator, J. Glenn Bell, and talk to him for 10 minutes and convince him that lobotomy was immoral and that he would support legislation cutting off federal funding. And Bell's constituency in Maryland was NIMH, NIH, the FDA, all with their major offices. His constituency, Johns Hopkins, which was dying to do psychosurgery, but eventually said they had to give it up until somebody would tell the Peter Breggins of the world to stick it. That's a pretty near a quote from their department chair there in neurosurgery. But we couldn't get past Ted Kennedy, and he's the most important person because he's chair of the Senate Committee on Health. So I did something the likes of which I wouldn't do as an older man. I got in touch with the most powerful columnist in the country at the time, Jack Anderson. He'd written a column about my life being threatened by a psychosurgeon who said that inmates of prisons who couldn't get his surgery were going to kill Breggin. He covered the story. I had it on my tape recording at a conference. So I said to Jack Anderson, his chief assistant, you tell Ted that if he keeps staying in our way, I'm going to blow the whistle on Rosemary. Just tell him that. I'm going to blow the whistle on Rosemary and what they did to her. Within a week or so, Kennedy announced he was going to hold hearings. I checked on it, but Breggin wasn't invited. I said to Jack Anderson's assistant, you tell him if Breggin's not invited, he's going to hold a press conference outside the doors, and you don't know what he might talk about.
And it's kind of obvious, but he's from Massachusetts, so everything going on in Boston is his constituency, right?
Thank you. That's right. everything that's going on in Boston is his constituency. You can bet your bottom dollar that he's got connections to the most powerful physician in the community, William Sweet, head of neurosurgery at the Mass General. So it was all there, but he also had this dark thing in his closet. So I never blew the whistle. I was a man of my word. And as much publicity as it would have gotten me, I never blew the whistle. The hearings were quite amazing. They were stacked for the psychosurgeons. After I had finished testifying, I sat down in the audience and Kennedy attacked me. He said that I was the kind of basically Neanderthal who would have burned Galileo at the stake. See, he was talking off the cuff, and the word is he actually was either alcohol impaired or he wasn't that bright. He wasn't like some of the other Kennedys. Because, of course, Galileo wasn't burned at the stake. And, of course, I was more like Galileo than the people who were burning him at the stake. But he believed that psychosurgery was the great new science. Maybe rationalizing Rosemary, I don't know the answer. So I'm sitting in the audience, I'm getting attacked, and I didn't know you never do this, that I could have gotten thrown out. I stood up and said, I'm going to reply to that. And the cameras turned to me. And you said, you don't have, I said, I'm going to reply to it. I'm going to. And then he got quiet. And he said, I want to tell you something. You're wrong, Senator Kennedy. Lobotomy is not like heart surgery. You said heart surgery sometimes weakens the heart to stop an arrhythmia, something that I'm sure he had been cued in on. But your heart's not your brain. When you impair your heart, Senator, you impair perhaps the circulation of your blood through your veins and arteries. But when you impair your brain, Senator, you impair the expression of your eternal soul. And I glared at him. Now, I had given this great scientific presentation before that. The New York Times covered the hearings, and they made mention of one Peter Bregan who stood up and objected on religious grounds. This was kind of the beginning of my training that you'd better say everything knowing that the New York Times, the Washington Post will either not acknowledge you if it's too good or take something out of context. But actually, there wasn't much I could do with that information because I was devoted to speaking my mind and speaking the truth. One of the surgeons in Boston was a man named Ballantyne. He was an elderly gentleman doing hundreds of psychosurgery cases, all of which he reported basically had no side effects, and were curing all these women with depression and obsessive compulsive disorder. And he had no medical supervision of any kind. There was no committee to supervise him. A few of his patients found me, or their families. They came to see me in Washington, D.C., where I was at the time, Bethesda, Maryland. They had to be brought. They were destroyed. So I began a series of lawsuits against Ballantyne. And some of the suits came to me, and some I referred to lawyers. At that point in time, my last visit to the American Psychiatric Association, the president of the association, Alan Stone, at the time, a professor at Harvard, including affiliations at the medical school, professor of the law school, Alan Stone said that by encouraging lawsuits, and this is in front of people at a kind of a cocktail party for everybody to meet, you know, the big APA convention, you are breaking the law, Peter, and I'm worried about you because we've been talking, and I've been talking to some Harvard professors, and we think you could go to jail for what you're doing. I had two reactions. The first was heart sinking into stomach, stomach sinking into legs. And then I said to him, Alan, you're a godsend. First, I've been waiting to get martyred. And second, my God, I'd have so much writing time in prison. I don't know where this came from, this capacity I had to stand up for myself. Although I've been like that since I was probably 3 years old. It was a very scary time. There were threats against my life. There were times when I had bodyguards. It was a very frightening time. At another psychiatric meeting, probably one of those two was the last one I went to. I was in Hawaii, and I did two things you never do at a psychiatric meeting. First, I held a conference, a news conference, on the most interesting, perhaps single episode that I will tell you about in a moment in the psychosurgery campaign. But then I did something truly unthinkable at the Psychiatric Association. I went and sat in at a lobotomy meeting. You don't do that. The psychoanalysts go to their meetings, the family therapists go to their meetings, the drug poisoners go to their meetings, the hospital managers go to their meetings, the shock doctors go to their meetings, the lobotomists go to their meetings, and nobody criticizes each other. And certainly the psychologically oriented psychiatrists never criticize their biological friends who do lobotomies and shock because they got all the power. Well, I went there, and I sat down, and they didn't know that I had come in early and put my little Sony tape recorder with its little thin plastic reel of recording tape, and that I had put it and turned it on before they started, and I had put it up on their table along with their own tape recorders. Nobody had any idea. And I sat down with 2 or 3 of colleagues of mine, actually, in the 3rd row. And one of the things they did was they brought in a lobotomy patient whom I didn't realize had been programmed to criticize me. And this is what my tape recorder captured. First, she said how wonderful it all was. Her husband was a minister, was really happy. She was doing her housework, and this was all better. And she goes terribly flat. And the interviewer leans over and said, some doctors say you can't have feelings. And he said, tried to prompt her to say, some people say you can't have feelings once you've had a lobotomy. And she didn't understand the question, even though she'd been prompted. And then he said something about, well, what about Dr. Brecken? And Mike Sony's there. And she said something, I wish I could remember exactly, but it was along the lines of, oh, he's a nice man. I mean, she had no idea. She'd forgotten. She had short-term memory disability. So they were really now stuck because she wouldn't say anything mean about me. She couldn't even remember who I was. All on the tape recorder. Then her surgeon stands up. All on the tape recorder. M. Hunter Brown, who's doing psychosurgery in California. And he's gotten into Vacaville, the mental hospital behavioral center, which is actually just a criminally insane facility that they let loose the medics and the behaviorists in. And he says, Peter, I'm worried about you. We've never met, of course, he and I. Peter, I'm worried about you. Standing up. I'm in touch with 30 prisoners at Vacaville who know that only if they get my surgery, psychosurgery, they will ever be able to get out of the jail. And I can't do it anymore because of you. And Peter, I'm worried about you because the word is one of them's going to escape and get you. Can you imagine the problem I would have had if I didn't have a tape recorder going? Meanwhile, I'm shaking in my boots because this is really getting crazy. Then Leo Alexander stands up. And he must have thought I was breathing down his neck. And he's the lobotomist and the shock doctor from Boston, and he says, and he's the one who's been calling me paranoid in the scientific literature, and he says, Peter, some of my patients have said they'd like to go see you. And I tell them, you're a paranoid schizophrenic. I stood up and I said, Dr. Alexander, that's a terrible thing to say. I don't know where the control came from when I was so young. It wasn't always there, but it seemed to be there when I needed it. I said, Dr. Alexander, would you please retract this horrible, horrible libel and slander? And he said in his German accent, because he had fled Germany, which is how a Nazi kind of doctor ended up in the US. He said, so sue me. Okay. Again, it would have been hopeless if I hadn't had the tape recorder. So, it's all over and I go back home. I'm really anxious now. I mean, stuff is really going on about me. I try to get a lawyer, take a suit against him. Nobody's interested. The APA sends me notice that they are going to charge me with disrupting a meeting at the American Psychiatric Association, that a Canadian visitor who later turned out to be having sex with his patients whom he was using heavy sedatives with. God, these people, they're not nice. This is an Australian, not a Canadian. You can probably Google that, somebody. Google Australian psychiatrist having sex with sedated patients. It's probably Googleable. It goes back a ways. Now, there's a method that you must follow if you're going to bring charges against a doctor in the Psychiatric Association. First, you must go to his local division, which would have been Washington, D.C., and you must file a complaint against him. Not the APA, somebody must file a complaint against him. And then eventually the charges might go up to a special committee. These charges were brought by the Board of Directors of the American Psychiatric Association, for which there was no mechanism. So we responded to them by saying, we won't come. We won't answer your charges. Here's a tape recording. You do anything to Dr. Bregan, you're going to get sued into the ground. Because I had found a good attorney. His name is Hank Schlossberg. Hank's Jewish. Hank wasn't going to take my malpractice suit either in the beginning until I told him that Leo Alexander had covered up the slaughter of the mental patients in Germany and had falsely claimed to have written the Nuremberg Code, and I talked to Jackson and written back and forth with Jackson, who was the head there, the head justice, and he said, Alexander had nothing to do with it. The judges wrote it. It's a part of the judgment. Nothing to do with it, he said. I think Alexander was breathing down his neck. And so Hank was so offended by that, he took this weird-looking case of suing Leo Alexander, and then he really got mad when the APA went after me. Well, the APA wrote back a letter and saying, well, if this tape is real, then we're not going to bring any charges against you. We're dropping the charges. Oh, there were such scary times. I was very young. I was totally alone. I hadn't met my wife yet, Ginger. Or at least we hadn't gotten together yet. Meanwhile, all kinds of things are happening. All over the world. I'm going to Great Britain, taking on the psychosurgeons. When I got to Great Britain in my anti-psychosurgery campaign, I was invited by the BBC to debate the most famous psychiatrist in Great Britain at the time, a man named William Sargent, who'd written a book called Battle for the Mind. And he was an older gentleman by then and was highly esteemed. When he walked into the BBC space, they came over and they kind of treated him like a big celebrity. Whereas I'm this young whippersnapper. I was probably 40 years old or something, young whippersnapper from Great Britain. I was the young whippersnapper from the U.S. And they told me that Sargent has said he was going to send me with my tail between my legs back to America. And I thought about experiences I had had with psychosurgeons, and I knew that they would consciously lie through their teeth. The same with electroshock doctors. You can't maintain something like lobotomy, electroshock, unless you are willing to lie through your teeth and try to destroy your critics. There's just no other way. And there's no other reason why I would have been the first psychiatrist in the history of the world to stand up publicly against electroshock and lobotomy. It's just too dangerous. The people who do that stuff are violent people. It's as if you walked into a room of 50 child abusers and started talking about child abuse. They want to kill you. Actually, it's kind of identical. So I picked one of his books. I don't think it was Battle for the Mind. I think it was a medical book. And I looked up what he had to say about lobotomy. And he said what people always said before I came along and started quoting him. They don't say it anymore. He said that lobotomy numbed the emotions, simplified people's minds. He even made an analogy between how when you're lobotomized, you'd go from being an Episcopalian to being a Methodist or something. He literally said something like that. And he was very straightforward about it. So I very carefully, when no one was looking, hid his book under my chair. They thought it was just my carry-on package or something. So I said to Sargent, when he denied that psychosurgery had any ill effects on the brain or mind, and when he denied specifically that it would dull anybody, I reached down, I pulled out his book, I bookmarked it, and I read it. Closed the book, put it back. And Sargent began to shake. He had nothing to say to me at all. He just was shaking. I decided to be very nice for the rest of the time. I don't remember quite how it ended, but I do remember as he was leaving, he was so distraught that no one paid us any attention to me. The 3 or 4 technicians and directors and all, they all went off with him trying to soothe him. When he was gone, the producer of the program came up to me and said, "We don't behave this way in Great Britain." Didn't know what to say about that. I went home, eventually, after giving some other talks, debated another psychiatrist. It didn't go well for him at all. I don't get mean, I just get factual. And then I got a note from the BBC, we didn't do email in those days, saying that this BBC program was the most popular they'd had in years, and all they got was, praise for Peter Breggin. Makes me want to cry, because it really wasn't easy, folks. In the midst of all this, I was involved with lawsuits against the psychosurgeons. One in particular was Ballantyne, H.T. Ballantyne, another great man of American medicine. Ballantyne, who burned holes in people's brains, was the chair of the AMA Committee on Ethics and specialized in going after chiropractors. So I would quip about him that while he was criticizing chiropractors for cracking bones, he was boring skull holes in the skulls of people and melting their brains. We lost a couple of lawsuits against Ballantyne because I think no one could really believe what was going on. And he was a great gentleman. And to this day, it's hard to win a malpractice suit in the suburbs of Boston, where all the people work who work at MGH and work at Boston City and so on. But it was so costly, and maybe there was somebody in the insurance companies, the malpractice insurance companies, who agreed with me. They cut off his insurance. He couldn't practice anymore. So he was down. I cut off all the funding to Mark Irvin and Sweet. That project was down. Jose Delgado was a physician from Spain, and he was apparently very close to the fascist dictator of Spain, from what I understood. He'd gotten medals from him. And he came over to the U.S. and got a professorship at Yale for a while. Keep him in mind. One of the big breakthroughs was when I was on the air talking about Thomas R., the patient I'd been researching of theirs through their literature, researching Mark Irvin Sweet's patient, Thomas R., whom I also saw at one point had also been called Leonard K. Apparently somebody heard me on the radio and called Leonard's mother in California. And I got a letter from Leonard's mother, and it said, "Now I understand. I knew they turned my son into a vegetable," she used that word, "but now I see what it was, what they were doing to him." I flew out to California and I met Leonard. I've since then actually met his grandson, nephew, communicated with the family. He's come to talk to me, or briefly or at length. And this man who was written up in Violence in the Brain is a Cure Without Side Effects, cured of his violence. This man, who was the star of the story by Crichton called Terminal Man, as sort of the miracles of psychosurgery, except it went awry electronically. This man was on weekend leave at his mother's house. He was lying in bed, and his head was covered with a tent of newspapers. He was in terror. He said, didn't say he was in terror, he said, "Doctors from Boston are trying to get my brain." He said, "I'm the most intelligent person in the world. I have an IQ of hundreds, and they're trying to get my brain." He was completely psychotic. It was a post-traumatic brain injury psychosis. Terrorized. Interestingly enough, he was even confused about where it had happened. He would say the doctors were from the Mass General. Only William Sweet was from the Mass General. Maybe Sweet had let him know that he was really the big deal, bigger than Irvin and bigger than Mark. I was shattered by this. It wasn't like, whoopee, look what I found. None of this was like, whoopee, look what I found. It was like, oh, God. And will I be able to tell people? He was unable to communicate with me. His mother told me that since coming back from Boston, his wife had rejected him. His wife had been the one to refer him to treatment. And the treatment people had referred him to Mark Irvin's suite, who had all this equipment and no patient. And it had gone through the VA. They'd taken him right off the VA wards. There's power, these people. And the first thing she did, one of the first things was she gave me a letter. She said, I'm his custodian. He's been horribly destroyed since he came back from Boston. He's had multiple hospitalizations, chronic patient at the VA. And by the way, I would find out that Mark Irvin's suite knew this. They knew this while they were writing their cure papers. She said he'll wander off and they'll pick him up in an emergency room and he'll say that doctors from Boston have been manipulating my brain and put holes in my head and they wouldn't believe him. They'd call him a paranoid schizophrenic, send him back to the VA. I said, I want to get his records. But I'm afraid if we ask for them, they'll purge them. I said, give me permission. I'm going to carry it right today, which I hadn't planned on, to the VA, to the record room, try to make friends, and get his records. And I did that. In those days, you didn't have the technology. I didn't have a copier with me. I had to take pieces and ask the very nice woman behind the counter to copy the records. One of the first things that fell out of the records was a handwritten note by him that doctors from the MGH were killing him or taking his brain or something to that effect. It was right in there. In the progress notes, I saw writing on the walls, murder. That's all, just writing on the walls, murder. He was completely psychotic, and the VA records did not note that he'd had psychosurgery. But I was able to show that, in fact, Mark had been in communication with the VA. I took a big chunk of records out of there. During my conversations with Helen Geis, his mother, she brought me a telegram. These are the days of telegram from Vernon Mark. She had written him and said, I hear my son is undergoing surgery. Can you please tell me about it? And the telegram said, don't worry, your son is undergoing minor surgery. We had it in print. Eventually, she asked me, Helen Geis, to find a lawyer to sue Mark and Irvin, and if possible, suite. I went back to Boston with a letter that I was to obtain a complete copy of Leonard Kyle's records, and I called Boston City Hospital, and they said, we have no such record. It's in Dr. Mark's private office. Isn't that interesting? I mean, these men, there's no respect for ethics, for protocol, for proper medical record protection. I called Dr. Mark's office and I said, I'm at a telephone booth with a reporter. I gave him the name. And if you don't deliver me a copy of those records in 24 hours, we're going to publish it. that you haven't done it. And I'd had awfully good coverage in Boston, and I got the records, or at least a big chunk of them. I think that day, it's hard to believe it would have been. In those records, I found things like, Leonard wants to leave the ward. Progress note by Frank Irvin, take his pants away. I was looking in on the life of a man who'd been as violently abused as any horrendous sexual, emotional, physical abuse. He might as well have been in a brainwashing camp in North Vietnam or North Korea, being tortured. They would just toy with his brain. They would toy with it while he was walking around, and he didn't know it turned on, so he didn't even know what was happening to him. And now, Delgado. I had come upon Delgado's book, Physical Control of the Mind. And I wrote about this. And by the way, for folks who want the best information, my summary on this, I could never get a book published about it. I got an article published, of all places, in the Duquesne Law Review, because I debated O.J. Andy at Duquesne Law School. Didn't go well for him. And I got to write this very heavily vetted, but in a good way, edited article for the Duquesne Law Review, and it's called The Politics of Psychosurgery. It is on my website as a PDF, and you can find it under the special section that's about social control, politics, and race, those issues. Well, I came across Physical Control of the Mind. God, I'm tempted to read from it. This is not my copy. Look at this. What struck me about Delgado, first of all, was that he was a political philosopher. He wasn't just a psychosurgeon that put electrodes in the brains of people and bulls. And he was a political philosopher who saw the fundamental principles of America, the Declaration of Independence in particular, as being scientifically incorrect based on the neuroscience of the 1960s, that humans aren't individuals. They're under the influence of all kinds of forces. That means they're not individuals. They may feel self-important, but they're not important. And they may think they had rights as individuals, but the society had rights, not the individual. It was a totalitarian philosophy under which he was doing social control and personal control of people. And one of the things that he was famous for was a little film clip showing that he could stop a violent bull. Couldn't wait to see this. I mean, was I going to see a bull who would charge him, and then he would press a button and the bull would sit like Ferdinand and fold his hoofs and maybe sniff some flowers and just be the sweet, gentle guy, sort of like Thomas R. or Leonard Kyle was supposed to be, you know, vicious and violent beforehand, but not afterward. Oh, by the way, it turned out that Leonard had never really been violent at all. He'd been in conflict with his wife, and the worst thing he ever did was to throw a can of food in her direction without hitting her. That earned him brain mutilation. So what happens if you look at the film of the bull? Well, multiple, apparently, sophisticated behavioralists and scientists have looked at this and been convinced that he could control violence. Well, there's a bull, there's Delgado, then there's an electrode in the bull's head. I don't remember whether you could see it. And I think it was only one electrode. And the bull is moving toward Delgado. He's not galloping. I don't remember it being menacing. You've seen the film more recently. Was he menacing?
I mean, there was one where he sort of,
He did.
half.
He
It's
sort
not,
of
it's
scratched the
not a full
ground or
charge,
something. He's not.
yeah.
He's not charging him. And all of a sudden, the bull speaks. My God, my head! You can actually see the bull. If he could have spoke, he goes, "Eh!" And he is in shock. He stops everything. He looks paralyzed. He turns in circles. And he's just blunted. It was nothing you couldn't have accomplished by hitting him in the back of the head with a sledgehammer. So of course you put an electric shock through some poor creature's brain. You're going to totally disrupt his behavior. I don't know why I didn't just fall down and have a seizure like an electric shock patient. It was hooey. It was complete nonsense. Delgado got together with Mark and Irvin. We know that. We know that Leonard Kyle had a receiver on top of his head that was probably the creation of Delgado. I'm really waiting for this film to find out more. So we have these American surgeons, some of the most famous in the country, getting funding from a combination of NIMH and the justice. Can you imagine anything more totalitarian than putting psychiatry and justice together? Getting direct funding because of the fears of racial uprisings that were taking place in America, and fear of the leadership, the young leadership, and fear of the young leadership that was coming out of the riots. And I don't condone any of that. That is not me. But I want to say I don't believe in their politics, and I might want to say they're dangerous. But I wouldn't, even if they were convicted of murder, want to unleash these psychosurgeons on them. There are protections against cruel and unusual punishment. Believe me, it is crueler to have done to you what was done to Leonard Kyle than to be put to death. It's crueler and more hopeless and more horrible. Not that I want to put anybody to death. Let me return to the before and after of Leonard Kyle. Leonard was having marital conflicts. Leonard believed that his wife was having an affair with his best friend. Leonard's wife denied it and sent him to her psychiatrist. Leonard had been in conflict with his wife, but he'd done nothing more serious than one sort of violent event. Not a nice thing. He threw a can at his wife of food and didn't hit her. That was the only fact I could find in the records that remotely resembled violence, and it was reported by his wife. His wife's psychiatrist had heard that Mark, Irvin, and Sweet were doing some new research. They had Leonard admitted to pay for the workup at the VA. The VA records showed him to be entirely normal. His brain waves were normal. He was normal. There's nothing really in the record that shows anything serious. And then they took him and put him in their project at Boston City. Up to that point, Leonard was a truly brilliant engineer. He'd worked for Polaroid and top names in engineering, and he had a number of U.S. patents. This was a brilliant man. He was not mentally disturbed. They turned him into a shell of a human being, where the spirit was still there, but it couldn't peep out very well through the tangled wires, the murdered brain cells. He was psychotic, and he was violent when restrained at times. He'd never been anything like that. Never been anything like that. I have puzzled over human evil for a long time. And I'm not sure I have more to say about it than anybody else, except I'm willing to call it human evil, which most folks aren't anymore. What was driving Mark Irvin and Sweet? What was driving Delgado? First, I think it's sadism. I think they're no different than men who sexually abuse their children and beat up their wives. Only they wear suits and they have patience. I do not believe they're fundamentally different than those kind of people. But the man who abuses his children and his wife doesn't also have a grand scheme going. And I think the grand scheme of these people takes a couple of forms. Igaz Muniz, who did the first multiple massive lobotomies in the Portuguese state mental hospital, got a Nobel Prize. I'm sure these men thought they were going to get a Nobel Prize because what they were doing was much more sophisticated than what Muniz did. I believe that Delgado, from his book, is unquestionably dreaming of being a fascist ruler or the arm of a fascist ruler through technology. He was getting awards in Spain. He was writing a book attacking the basic principles of Western civilization. I really believe that the American Constitution and our Bill of Rights in particular, and our Declaration of Independence, and our Federalist Papers are the culmination of Western thinking on the individual's relationship to society and on focusing on the individual, and in their case, the individual's relationship to God as the bedrock of all government and society, the individual and the individual's family. I believe that Delgado, like many Marxists at the time, and I don't know if he was a Marxist, but maybe you'll find out and we'll hear about it in the film, but his view was 100% consistent with society versus the individual, doing anything to the individual in the name of the social good. So I think he was also promoting an ideology in which he expected to be a leader. That Mark and Irvin would associate with such a man tells you at least something about their ideology, because Delgado wasn't hiding any of that. So the original edition of Delgado's book was in '69, so they knew what he was thinking. And they themselves, with apparently not a blink of conscience, were willing to talk about operating on black leaders to stop the urban uprisings. And were claiming that there's something wrong in the brains of children and adults who living in poverty, living amid terrible broken families and rotten schools and gangs and drugs, that there was something inherently the matter with these kids in their brains. Now, we also know that Irvin, for example, made remarks that to the effect that being a do-gooder or goody two-shoes or nice to people, that was a pretty good idea, but you wouldn't get any money from that. So they knew that the way to get money was to play on political and social fears and on racism. So I think there's a whole hodgepodge that's going on in here, feeding what is inherent in all of our human natures, which is our wish for power, our wish for glory, and maybe even a little touch of sadism in most of us, which we control through love and reason and ethics and principles, which is what human beings have tried to do forever, and we're forever failing. And these men are just riding that horse of violence, riding that horse of I'm right, you're wrong. I'm white, you're black. I'm a neurosurgeon, you're a nobody. I think they're just riding all of those negative human emotions, integrating it into totalitarian philosophies, hoping to be admired and appreciated and lauded someday as great innovators, and maybe even have political power.